This video is kindly sponsored by Ground News. In the autumn of 1869, a bunch of farmers in upstate New York were digging a well when, oh, what's this? They hit something solid. As they cleared away more dirt, they uncovered what appeared to be a giant stone foot, then a leg, then a torso. Holy crap, it's a giant stone dude. One of the workers, completely stunned, shouted, "I declare, some old Indian has been buried here." Except this wasn't just any old burial. This was a 10-foot tall, petrified man, perfectly preserved in stone. And not just preserved, this guy was anatomically correct, if you know what I mean. Full package, giant stone junk, the works. News spread faster than a viral TikTok. Within days, thousands of people were flocking to this tiny hamlet called Cardiff. Picture it. Horse-drawn carriages backed up for miles, people camping in fields, newspaper reporters from all across the country clamouring for a glimpse. All to see what? A giant stone naked guy laying in a pit. Or maybe confirmation of the biblical narrative. But here's the real question. Was this actually a fossilized biblical giant from Genesis? Short answer, nope, it wasn't. The long answer is, well, that's why we're here, isn't it? What follows is the story of America's greatest archaeological hoax, and I'm here for it. Let's back up a few years. It's 1866, and our story begins with a cigar salesman named George Hull. Hull was an atheist, kind of rare for the time, but still participating in classic atheist hobbies, not collecting stamps and arguing with the faithful. One of those arguments was with a Methodist preacher named Reverend Mr. Turk about the Bible. The preacher insisted that the Bible should be taken literally, including Genesis 6:4. There were giants on the earth in those days. Hull was like, you can't be serious, dude. But the preacher was dead serious. That night, as Hull lay in bed, a thought crossed his mind. What if I created a stone giant and buried it in the ground? How many suckers would believe that it was real? And, more importantly, how much money could I make off those suckers? Because Hull wasn't just an atheist, he was also kind of a dick. He kept this plan in his back pocket for about 2 years. Then, in 1868, he decided it was time to get this show on the road. So who was this hardcore giant-making, preacher-trolling, cigar-selling swindle master George Hull? He was a businessman from Binghamton, New York, and by all accounts, not a particularly nice person. Described as unscrupulous, Hull had already made a name for himself through various sketchy business dealings. He also had a flair for the dramatic and a contempt for religion that bordered on obsession. Who could possibly relate? Hull knew that to make a convincing giant, he needed the right materials and absolute secrecy. So he travelled all the way to Fort Dodge, Iowa, where there were gypsum quarries. Gypsum is a soft stone that looks kind of like marble, perfect for faking a fossilized human. He rolled up to the quarry owners and was like, "Hi, yes, I would like to purchase a 12-foot block of gypsum, please." "For what?" they asked. "Oh, I'm commissioning a statue of Abraham Lincoln." Makes sense, right? Nothing says Honest Abe like a huge block of fake marble. And this truly was a lot of fake marble, about 5 tons of it, and it wasn't cheap either. Hull spent about $2,600 on this whole operation, which would be roughly $50,000 today. Yeah, this wasn't some half-arsed prank. This dude was in it to win it. Hull then shipped this massive 5-ton block to Chicago, where he hired a German stonecutter named Edward Borja to carve it into a giant man. The stonecutter was like, "This is weird, but okay." Hull swore him to secrecy, and also brought in 2 sculptors to help with the finer details. Hull, wanting to make sure that the giant looked authentically gianty, actually stripped down and posed as the model himself. At least, that's what he insisted upon in the future, for unknown reasons. Picture that, if you will. Or actually, maybe don't. Remember, the giant needed to convince as many people as possible, so it needed everything the stonecutters could bring to the table. They added realistic details, veins, pores, and even wrinkles. They carefully positioned the giant laying on his back, with one arm across his belly and a slight smile on his face, like he died peacefully after a particularly satisfying last meal. They rubbed it with sand and stained it with acid to make it look ancient. When the giant was finally complete, it measured over 10 feet long and weighed nearly 3,000 pounds. Hull shipped it by rail to the farm of his cousin, William Stubb Newell, in Cardiff, New York. In the middle of the night in late November 1868, they buried the giant in a spot behind Newell's barn. They even positioned it under tree roots to make it look like it had been there for centuries. Then they waited. For almost a year. On the 16th of October, 1869, Newell hired two local well diggers, Gideon Emmons and Henry Nichols, and insisted that they dig in the exact spot where the giant was buried. And what are the odds? They found it! These workers weren't in on the hoax. Their genuine shock was part of selling the whole thing. I mean, imagine digging a few feet down and suddenly uncovering a massive stone foot. These poor guys nearly had a heart attack on the spot. Word spread through the tiny hamlet of Cardiff like wildfire. By afternoon, dozens of locals had shown up to gawk at the giant in his muddy grave. Newell, being the entrepreneurial fellow he was, quickly threw up a tent over the giant and started charging admission. At first, just 25 cents. But after seeing how many people were showing up, he doubled it to 50 cents for a 15-minute viewing. Let's put that into perspective. 50 cents in 1869 was about $10 in today's money. That's $10 to look at a fake stone dude in a hole for 15 minutes. Though, to be fair, that is definitely still better value than today's Ken Ham's Ark encounter. We've gotta give credit where credit is due. Within a week, an estimated 2,500 people had paid to see the giant. Cardiff transformed into what the newspapers called Giantsville. Hotels filled up, food stands popped up, and perhaps most amusingly, hucksters arrived selling genuine giant souvenirs. The road to this tiny farm clogged with traffic from all over the state. Local bank vaults were emptied as visitors withdrew cash to spend in town. According to Andrew D. White, who would later become the first president of Cornell University, visitors viewed the giant with an air of great solemnity. Inside the tent, people hardly spoke a whisper, as if they were in a church viewing a holy relic. Many who saw the giant were absolutely convinced it was real, especially the religious types who already believed that giants once roamed the earth. No longer must they rely on "for the Bible tells me so." No, here, at last, was proof. The book of Genesis had been vindicated. There were, indeed, giants on the earth. Damn it. One clergyman declared it was so evidently the fact that we have here a fossilized human being, perhaps one of the giants mentioned in scripture. Meanwhile, scientists were like, guys, we're about to plummet down the rabbit hole, but first, while browsing Ground News with my morning coffee, I skipped the top stories, Donald Trump being sworn in as the US president, and took a good look at today's Blind Spots, a wonderful feature that highlights the stories that are being disproportionately reported by the left or the right. It's tools like these why Ground News has become an indispensable part of my daily routine. You can follow along at ground.news/rationality. For the left, I can see that they're underreporting Trump's administration cancelling flights for 1,600 Afghan refugees, as Trump himself claims he was saved by God to make America great again, and the ADL says that Elon Musk's awkward hand gesture was not a Nazi salute. Meanwhile, the right evidently couldn't care less about North Korea's casualties in Russia's Kursk, Trump instructing aides to arrange a call with Putin, and China importing a record amount of Russian crude oil. And of course, for any of these stories, we can click through and get a concise summary and gauge how each outlet presents the facts. For instance, while all coverage reports on China's increased Russian oil imports, their framing varies significantly. Reuters emphasizes the 9% drop in Saudi Arabian purchases. Bloomberg, meanwhile, focuses on how Asian processors are expanding their search for alternative oil sources following the recent US sanctions targeting Russian oil. We get the same facts, but different story. In today's world of competing headlines and curated narratives, finding unbiased news can feel impossible. That's why I rely on Ground News. They cut through the noise to deliver just the facts. By signing up through this link, you'll not only gain access to balanced news coverage, but you'll also support the Rationality Rules team. Thanks. Not everyone was buying the petrified man story. In fact, skepticism started on day one. Some of Newell's neighbours immediately questioned why he would dig a well at that particular location. After all, it's inconveniently far away from his house, and there was already a perfectly good water source nearby. Something wasn't adding up, something smelled off, and it wasn't giant feet. Alas, with nothing but doubt and logic to express, they couldn't deter the visitors that kept flooding in. Academics and scientists soon arrived to examine the giant. John F. Boynton, a geologist, took one look and said, "Ha! This isn't a petrified man at all. Finally, someone had figured it out." Yeah, not quite. Instead of calling it out as a modern hoax, he came up with his own outlandish theory that it was probably carved by a French Jesuit missionary in the 1600s to impress Native Americans.
Oh my god! Wow!
Turns out that scientists can be gullible too. They just prefer a different flavour of nonsense. James Hall, the New York State geologist, also checked it out. He proclaimed it the most remarkable object yet brought to light in this country, but thought it was an ancient statue rather than a petrified man. The most clear-headed assessment came from Andrew D. White. He immediately recognised the giant as a fraud, pointing out both the suspicious location of the find and the crude tool marks visible on the statue. But as White noted, in spite of all the scientific reasons to the contrary, the work was very generally accepted as a petrified human being. People wanted to believe, and when people want to believe something, they are remarkably good at ignoring evidence to the contrary. Sound familiar? At this point, Hull decided it was time to cash in. Within days of the discovery, he showed up in Cardiff to meet Newell. By the end of the month, a group of 5 wealthy businessmen led by David Hannum offered $30,000 for a 3/4 stake in the giant, valuing it at $40,000. Hull and Newell accepted the deal. Of course they did, it was a no-brainer. Are you serious? That much money for a practical joke? Sign us up. Hull's share amounted to about $23,000, turning his $2,600 investment into nearly 800% profit in just 1 year. That's about $500,000 in today's dollars. A massive success. The new owners quickly took over the exhibition. On the 5th of November, Hannum's syndicate raised the giant from its pit and shipped it to Syracuse, New York, for a larger exhibition, and the crowd followed. People by the thousands paid to see the Cardiff Giant in Syracuse, and it taught other cities too. But wider exposure also brought greater scrutiny. Some locals in Cardiff remembered Hull carting a mysterious large crate to the farm a year earlier. In Iowa, people recalled him shipping a big gypsum block under odd circumstances. And while they were squinting their eyes, so too was someone else. Enter P.T. Barnum, who's not just the ultimate showman, but also kind of a dick. When Barnum heard about this amazing attraction, he travelled to see the giant and was so impressed that he offered $50,000 to buy it outright, an astronomical amount. Hannum's group, though, refused, thinking they had an endless gold mine. So what did Barnum do? He did what any of us would do. He said, "Alright, fair enough, I'll take my leave," and in the morning, oh no, he didn't do that at all. No, he made his own damn giant. Indeed, he secretly sent an agent to take measurements and make wax impressions of the giant's shape and size. Then he had an exact plaster replica created, which he put on display in New York, boldly claiming, right, that his is the real Cardiff Giant and that the one in Syracuse is fake. You couldn't make this stuff up, people. This is brilliant. Right, let's now get this straight. We now have a fake of a fake, and ordinary people? Well, they just had to see this one too. Barnum's promotional campaign was characteristically over the top. His New York Museum ads asked provocative questions like, what is it? Is it a stupendous fraud? Is it the remains of a former race? The public didn't know which one to believe, but Barnum's Giant actually drew bigger crowds than the original. In fact, when the original Cardiff Giant arrived in New York in December 1869, Barnum's copy outsold it in ticket sales. When Hannum heard of this, he supposedly uttered a phrase commonly misattributed to Barnum: "There's a sucker born every minute." That's rather rich, don't you think, coming from a guy already peddling a hoax. Hannum was so incensed by Barnum's copy that he sued him for calling the Cardiff Giant a fake, which it absolutely was, and for copying it. But when the case went to court in early 1870, the judge dryly refused to issue an injunction, saying Hannum would get relief only if his giant could swear to its own genuineness in court, which, as you can imagine, would be quite the challenge. And so that was the end of that. While Hannum flailed in court, more damning scientific evidence was piling up. The renowned Yale paleontologist Nathaniel C. Marsh visited the giant in Syracuse. After only a brief examination, Marsh declared the Cardiff Giant of very recent origin and a most decided humbug. He noted the fresh chisel marks on the gypsum and pointed out, crucially, that no intact gypsum statue could survive long in damp earth. You see, gypsum is water soluble. It would have dissolved. Marsh published a scathing report on the 25th of November 1869, detailing all the evidence of fraud. A mining engineer also chimed in, explaining that if the giant had lain in wet ground for centuries, the gypsum would have softened and deteriorated beyond recognition. The walls were closing in on the great Cardiff Giant hoax. By the end of the year, it was turning from a national wonder into a national joke. Skeptics were winning the day, and even Hull himself began hinting at the truth. Then, on the 10th of December, Hull decided to come clean and confess everything to the press. He proudly detailed how he had conceived and executed the giant to dupe the faithful and expose their credulity. Most crucially, he insisted it was modelled on himself. I told you, he was a bit of a dick. He made it clear that his goal was to satirise the biblical literalists who believed giants once roamed the earth. Though, let's be honest, the $20,000 profit probably didn't hurt either. Even without Hull's admission, the evidence of fraud had become overwhelming. Early the following year, newspapers published interviews with the Chicago sculptors who had carved the giant, corroborating Hull's story. Finally, on the 2nd of February, 1870, a court case in New York legally confirmed what most scientists, or at least a lot of them, had been saying all along. The Cardiff Giant, well, both of them, were fake. The giant hoax had been fully exposed. Public fascination quickly gave way to ridicule. The giant, once the centre of feverish speculation, now became a source of embarrassment for the gullible. The scientists who had expressed skepticism openly laughed about the absurdity, and the theologians who had defended the giant fell silent in embarrassment. Now, I know what you're thinking. What happened to our stone friend after his exposure? Though unmasked as a hoax, the Cardiff Giant didn't disappear immediately. Hannum's syndicate continued to exhibit the stone figure for years to come, trying to squeeze a bit more profit from curious crowds. But interest dwindled significantly after 1870, and by the end of the decade, the giant was more of a travelling sideshow oddity than a serious attraction. George Hull, undeterred by being exposed, went on to orchestrate at least one more giant hoax. In 1876, he created the Solid Muldoon in Colorado, a fake petrified man made of clay and ground bone. But the public, they wouldn't be fooled a second time. Nope. The original Cardiff Giant changed hands several times in subsequent decades, and was even displayed at the 1901 Pan American Exhibition in Buffalo, though it garnered little attention there. Eventually, the giant was hauled off to obscurity, stored in a barn for years, where it could no longer draw crowds. In a twist of fate, the giant that had sold for $23,000 in 1869 was later sold as mere storage leftovers. It ended up with Iowa publisher Garden Cowles Jr., who used the 3,000-pound giant, right, as a coffee table conversation piece in his home. I kid you not, imagine having people over. Oh, that thing. Oh, that's just America's greatest archaeological hoax. Could you pass me the cheese, please? Finally, in 1947, the New York State History Association purchased the giant for around $30,000 and brought it to Copperstone, New York. Since then, it has been on permanent display at the Farmers Museum, housed in a tent-like shed reminiscent of its original exhibition. Visitors can still see the famed hoax, now openly labelled America's Greatest Hoax, and reflect on the gullibility of an earlier age. Meanwhile, Barnum's 1869 plaster copy of the giant also survives. It resides at, this is going to be a mouthful, Marvin's Marvelous Mechanical Museum in Michigan, as a fake of a fake on display, because of course it does. Now, before we get too smug about those 19th century rubes who fell for a fake giant in a hole, we should probably take a long hard look at our own social media feeds, where modern Cardiff Giants lurk in every corner, from health scams to political conspiracies to whatever pseudo-scientific nonsense is making the rounds this week. The real lesson of the Cardiff Giant isn't that people were especially gullible in 1869. No, it's that we're all susceptible to believing what we want to believe, regardless of the evidence. Maybe we truly are all just suckers, born every minute, paying 50 cents to stare at a stone man in a hole. And that, my fellow apes, is the story of America's greatest archaeological hoax, the Cardiff Giant. If you want to see more episodes like this, do let me know. I really enjoy these stories, and I would happily tell you more of them, because there's quite a few of them. Thanks.